Is it live?
I don't see it yet.
I see live on my screen,
Yeah.
but
Oh, okay, I see it. It should be I see it now. So we're ooh. Okay. I forgot to do that one thing. All right. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We have the great honor of having Dr. Joe Milanovich from Loyola University going to be sharing with us everything he knows about amphibians, and we're really excited to have Mr. Milanovich. I remember the first time he's been participating with us for a couple of years now, and I remember the first time he was kind of like, well, what would I share? And anyway, I think you guys are going to find him really exciting, and his research really exciting. So thank you, Dr. Milanovich. I'm going to let you take it away.
all right, thank you. So I'm happy to be here, everyone. Um, it's a really honor. I love doing this. It's super fun. So what I want to do first is tell you a bit about myself just for a minute, and then we can get into the presentation and talk about amphibians for a while. So I had a really different path into becoming an ecologist. I'm really a wildlife biologist right now. And growing up, I grew up in Detroit, in the Detroit area, and I didn't know what science was. I wasn't really catching amphibians or organisms really for most of my life. So that's pretty unique in the sense that most ecologists kind of grow up doing it. I didn't grow up doing it, but I found it in college. One of my faculty members that where I went to college at Adrian College in Michigan had a research program that studied amphibians and reptiles. So I just really fell in love with it relatively late in life. And then I was able to pursue it as a career. So my position at Loyola is really unique in the sense that I get to teach students at the college level, but I also get to do a lot of research. So that's what this talk is about. It's about amphibians and what we know about them and why we should care about them. So I should note that, I have a few slides to go through, but feel free to ask any questions at any point in time, even if it's unrelated to what I'm talking about. And I'll be happy to answer them as I go along with the presentation. So we can have this pretty free flowing and pretty loose. So feel free to ask any questions you want. Okay, so let's talk about amphibians for a while. What we know today is that there's about 7,800 or so amphibian species, and this is globally across the world. And I say about because every time we go out looking for more, especially in the tropics, we find more. So just last week, there's a new species of frog discovered. So we keep finding new and new species, especially in tropical areas in South America and Asia and in Central America, which is really cool. But what we do know is that most of amphibians are frogs or toads. We'll talk a bit about the difference there as well. Then you have another group of amphibians that are salamanders or newts, which is just a type of salamander. And then you have this unique group that makes up about 3% of amphibians, and these are called caecilians. They are these legless, worm-like, snake-like looking amphibians that live in the tropics. But they are diverse where they live, but they just don't live in a lot of areas. So we have thousands of species of amphibians in the world, and they're all really unique, and they have all these really cool adaptations. And we could talk about some of those, and then we'll talk about some of the threats that amphibians have. But the cool thing to note, and I think this is a really unique thing to think about, is that the amphibians that we've seen today, they have ancestors that lived on Earth for 315 million years. So think about all that happened throughout that time frame. You have hundreds of millions of years on Earth, all those different changes to the climate and the environment and the world and the animals and plants. And these amphibians have survived all of that. So their lineages that exist today had ancestors that survived through all that. So we think of them as being really sensitive, and in some cases they are, but they're also really robust. And the fact that they are threatened today, which we'll talk a lot about, is what worries us most because they've been around for so long. So this is a map, and this is a really cool website if you want to learn more about amphibians. It's called amphibiaweb.org, and they have descriptions and information and pictures about hundreds and hundreds and thousands of amphibian species in the world. And this map here shows you some diversity of amphibians across the world. So this really is just indicating how many amphibian species are generally in these areas. So the darker areas here in Central America and South America and Asia, that's representing areas that have a lot of species. And then if you look at other parts like Europe and some parts of Africa and North America, relatively we have less species of amphibians there. So there's less types of amphibians in North America in general than there are in other parts. What you can see is that if you draw a line in the equator, we see that there's a really strong relationship with the equatorial region and amphibians. It's just the perfect habitat, right? These things, as we'll talk about, have certain characteristics where they do really well, where it's wet and moist and humid sometimes. So these amphibians sort of congregate with respect to their species along this equatorial gradient. It's not to say that there aren't species elsewhere that are pretty unique. This right here is a picture of a patch-nosed salamander. And this is my favorite amphibian species because it's one that I discovered with colleagues of mine. In fact, Bill Peterman, a good friend of mine that's at Ohio State University, actually found this animal here. This is a female. She's the first one ever found of the species that we described. And what's unique about it is a couple things. Firstly, it was so distinct that it had to be a whole new genus, not just a new species. Secondly, it was found about right here in North Georgia on the South Carolina-Georgia border, which is pretty unique as well because it was the first four-legged animal that was new to the United States in about 60 years when the time we found it. Some other cool things about it, this is an adult female. She has eggs in her belly, and look what she's sitting on, a dime. She can curl up on a dime. So if you have a dime at home, take a look at it and think about how small that is. This is an adult animal. And she has eggs in her belly and she fits on a dime. So it's one of the smallest salamanders in the whole world. Very, very cool. And what we know, a couple things about this, where they live is really, really small. Just a couple square miles is where they live entirely their whole life. Their babies actually live in the water, so they hatch out in the water. They're very tiny, the tip of a pencil tiny. And we call it the patch-nosed salamander because you can see it has this nice patch on the nose. Even the babies have it. So the first question is, how did we ever find that? It's so small. And we can defer to Bill Peterman about that question. What we basically did was we went out looking for other types of salamanders. And when Bill was looking for those, he turned over a leaf, a single leaf. And this salamander was attached to the underside of that leaf. So it was complete luck, really, but skill from Bill that he identified this as something that was unique to bring back because it was so small. Then we went through this process of identifying it and figuring out if it was really a new species or not. And that was a really collaborative effort, but it was also super fun. So what this suggests is that what we see is that the diversity in this area, especially in the Southeast US, isn't great overall compared to other areas, but you can still find new species and new genus of organisms, of amphibians, even in areas that are heavily populated. So why are amphibians so cool? There's a couple reasons that we'll talk about. The first one I just mentioned, they're really diverse. There's thousands of species of these organisms. Here are just a few species that we have in the Chicago area. This is a tiger salamander here and the pickerel frog. These are local to the Chicago area. This is the red salamander right here. And this is not necessarily local to Chicago, but it's pretty close. Within 100 miles or so, you can find these. So we have a lot of diversity. These organisms are really different. They have different life histories. They do different things. And they're really unique animals. What we also know is that these organisms are really abundant. And I mentioned Bill Peterman, and Bill and I recently published a paper. We did the scientific study that looked at how abundant these salamanders were. We focused on one type of salamander. And what I'm showing you here, this is called the slimy salamander. It's called that for a reason. It slimes your hands and it makes it really tough to work with. But these little things are unique in the sense that they are lungless. So this is a salamander, has a vertebrae, 4 legs and everything, and it has no lungs. It evolved not having any lungs. So what it allowed them to do is live in the forest where it's wet and moist, and it slowed down their physiology so much that they can live really abundantly in these areas. So what Bill and I did was we counted these salamanders and we looked at how much biomass they had in the forest. And we looked at one forest in Missouri. And what we found was that these animals, if you weigh all the salamanders in the forest, they weigh more than all of the birds, all of the small mammals, and even deer. So even though these things are about the size of your finger, they outweigh all of these other organisms because there's so many of them in the landscape. So I have one more question here. Where do you find salamanders in the Chicago area? And I will tell you, I know a couple places that are really cool. And I just took my kids there last weekend. A lot of the forest preserves in Chicago, especially ones that have ponds around. If there's any ponds that you can see on a map, or if you look and you maybe hear frogs or see a little pond, that's a really good place to look for salamanders. What you'll find there are salamanders that are called pond breeding salamanders, much like this one right here, this tiger salamander. They live in a lot of areas around Chicago in the forest preserves. But around here, if you want to find them, look for a forested wetland or an area where there's water and there's a forest around it, and you'll have a good chance of finding them. Some other cool things about amphibians are that they have really different life cycles. Like I mentioned, some amphibians are actually lungless, and we call those terrestrial salamanders because they never go in the water at all to breed or to even hang out for the most part. Now, there are a couple different types of those salamanders that don't have lungs. Some of them are completely terrestrial, so they'll lay eggs in the land and the eggs will hatch out and they'll look like little baby salamanders. They won't have gills, they won't need water or anything. There's another type of those that are lungless still, but they actually lay their eggs in the water in streams, and the eggs hatch out and they act like little fish and they swim around and then they grow up and live on the land. But most amphibians are what we call biphasic. That just means they have this life cycle where they need water. So there's a group of lungless salamanders that do this. Almost all the frogs in the world do this as well, and almost all the salamanders do. So we have an adult frog here. They'll lay their eggs sometimes on the land, most of the time in the water. They'll hatch into these tadpoles, turn into these baby frogs, and then back to the adult frog. That life cycle is pretty typical of most frogs, and that's called a biphasic life cycle. We see some salamanders, especially most of the salamanders that live in the Chicago area. They do this as well. They live in the land as an adult. They lay eggs in the water. Those eggs turn into these little larvae that swim around in the water and eat bugs, and they have gills. And then they usually hatch out into adults. A couple of them can just stay in the water and breed too. Those are called paedomorphs. They can lay eggs too. But you can see that there's a couple different life cycles here that make amphibians really unique. And then what we see is that they are called poikilothermic. And really, that's a term for meaning that they are ectothermic or cold-blooded. Now, I don't like to use the term cold-blooded because the blood isn't actually cold. All that means is that these salamanders and frogs, being ectothermic, they just regulate their body temperature from the environment. So their blood isn't really cold or warm, it's just what the environment is. So we should now switch from saying cold-blooded to saying ectothermic or poikilothermic. And then we have this group of salamanders that I talked about a lot here. This is another slimy salamander. This is a picture taken in a mine shaft in Arkansas. And here's the mom. She lays her eggs in a mine shaft or usually under logs or rocks in the forest. And you can see she takes care of them. So she actually protects them. She keeps them clean. If someone comes and tries to eat them, she'll bite them and protect them from that. And these little babies will eventually hatch out, and they'll hang out with mom for a few days, and then they'll disperse out into the area. They don't need water at all. Amphibians are also really cool because they have permeable skin. And I think that's cool because what it does is it allows amphibians to live in a lot of areas and really slow down their life cycle because they're ectothermic. They have this porous skin, so they need this exchange with water. And most amphibians can actually use that porous skin to breathe. So a lot of them have lungs. Most amphibians have lungs, but they can also breathe through their skin as well. So that's an advantage in a lot of ways because it allows them to live in these really unique habitats. A lot of them can live underground because of this. They can live in water and on land, but it also presents an issue too, because when your skin is porous, if there's any toxins in the water, or if the environment isn't really suitable, or if there's something that can exchange with their skin, then yeah, they can actually be harmed by that. So there's another question here by Brittany who asks if thermal pollution can hurt them. Can it be too hot or too cold? The answer is yes. So a lot of amphibians do actually hibernate in the winter. They'll brumate in the winter. And some amphibians have ways to combat that, where they can flood their body with sugars or convert their blood to be a little bit toxic, kind of acidic a bit. And that can help their cells from not bursting when they freeze. So a lot of amphibians can do that, but not all. Some amphibians, and most of them up around Chicago area, actually need to stay below freezing. So they can't even get freezing. So cold temperatures definitely hurt them. And warm temperatures can too as well, especially if it's dry and warm. So remember, amphibians have porous skin. So most of them need to stay wet and moist all the time. So if it gets dry, then and it's too hot as well, it can actually dry them out and kill them. We also have some evidence that amphibians can be affected by climate change, where the climate just gets too warm where they can't tolerate it, especially animals that live really high on mountaintops where it's always cool and moist. If it gets too warm there, then they generally have trouble surviving pretty well. Another question by Brittany, how do they hibernate in the winter? There's a couple ways to do it. Most amphibians will actually just burrow down into the ground or go into a wetland where it doesn't freeze completely, where they can live in that environment where it's just above freezing or a little bit above. And some of them, like this animal here, this is the wood frog, they actually do something really unique. They allow themselves to freeze completely. They flood their body with sugar. They build it in their liver and they push it out through their blood. So then every cell is encased with sugar. And wood frogs are unique in the sense that they live up here in Chicago. They live all the way up into Alaska. And they completely freeze solid, where their heart stops, their brain activity stops for sometimes weeks on end. And then when they thaw out in the spring, they do it from the inside out. So the inside of their body thaws out, their heart starts beating, and then the outside of their body thaws out. And then within a couple days, they move to wetlands and ponds and they breed. So this is an animal that you can find in the Chicago area, especially in northern Indiana a lot. And they have that cool of an adaptation to survive the winter. They freeze solid. Okay, so what I want to talk about now are why the amphibians are declining. And again, if you have any questions, just go ahead and shoot me some questions and I can answer them. So what we're seeing now is that amphibians are undergoing an extinction event. And if you look at this figure here, this is showing you the number of families of species in the world. And this is looking at several millions of years. So what we see is that there were 5 times in history where the world underwent what is called a mass extinction event. And that just means that there are lots and lots of species. Most species on Earth went extinct within a really short period of time. So we can see these peaks here where these happened. And most of them were several hundred million years ago, But the last one that happened was in this time called the late Cretaceous. It was about 65 million years ago. An asteroid hit the Earth, it blocked out the sun, and it actually killed all the dinosaurs and most other animals on Earth. But what happened was amphibians survived. Most reptiles survived, and they lived on to evolve to all the species that we know today. We had some small mammals living, some birds survived, and this was, again, about 65 million years ago. That was the last one that happened. What we're seeing today is that for amphibians and some other species, some other taxa, they're going extinct at a rate that's so fast that is considered a mass extinction event. So what we know with this is that it's entirely human driven. Humans and the change that we're causing to the earth are causing a mass extinction event of amphibians globally that rivals these past 5 events that have happened. And what I should note is that the earlier ones that weren't from an asteroid impact, they happened really quick on geologic time, which means they happened over thousands of years. What's happening to amphibians now has started happening within 100 or 200 years at most. So before we move on, I have another question here. So Bridget says she found a salamander under some leaves in April. So she wants to know, how did it keep from freezing if it wasn't that deep? Well, the cool thing about salamanders and frogs is that they can actually have an active hibernation. So in April, it probably thawed out just enough that they surfaced to the top. They were probably in some sort of soil or a burrow, and they came up to see if they can get anything to eat. So if the temperature is warm enough where they can move around, they'll come up on the surface. And then if it gets too cold where they start to freeze again, they'll just burrow right down again. Okay, so how do we know amphibians are going extinct to the rate at which we want to call it a mass extinction event? So what we know is that currently about 1/3, so 1 out of 3 of every amphibian species on Earth is actually at risk of going extinct. So that's 30% or more of species that we know of. And remember, we keep finding species every day are going extinct. And extinction is normal in the animal world. Animals do go extinct, and the rate of that extinction is pretty low, though. Usually we have 1 to 5 or so species a year go extinct naturally. And that has happened for, as far as we can tell, millions of years. But what we see now is that the rate at which amphibians are going extinct is thousands and thousands of times faster and higher than what we know should normally happen. So that's what's worrying us so much about amphibians. What we do know is that almost 170 species of amphibians have already gone extinct on Earth just in the past 20 years. So why are amphibians under threat and why are they going extinct? Well, there's a number of reasons, and I just want to talk about 5 of them right now. And we'll talk about these in order. They relate to habitats being destructed. There's some diseases around. There's a lot of pollutants. We see climate change and then pet trade and overexploitation. I'll talk about all these individually. First, we have another question here. Are salamanders herbivores, or are they considered carnivores or insectivores? Well, all salamanders actually eat bugs, 100%. They're all predators. So much so that we think that salamanders are so abundant in some cases that they can actually regulate how many bugs are in the environment. And they can be such an important part of the environment that makes them this kind of predator, this top predator in a lot of systems. Even though a lot of stuff eats them, there's so many of them that they can be really one of the top predators in streams sometimes. So all salamanders are insectivores. In fact, I would say all frogs as well, all amphibians, they all just eat bugs. Okay, so let's talk about amphibians and why they're declining. One of the main reasons they're declining is habitat change. So humans are cutting down forest, we're converting prairies to agriculture, we're building cities and expanding cities. And all that does is a couple things. It takes away habitat from these animals. And even the habitat that we are left with, that we leave amphibians, are what we call fragmented. So if you look at this picture here, there's a big patch of forest in the middle, there's some forest in the back here, but in between those patches of forest, there's a lot of farmland. And we need farmland as humans to feed us, but what that does for amphibians is it actually breaks up these habitats and makes them smaller and not connected as much. And that alone can have a big impact on amphibians and where they live and how they can get around to different areas. A lot of amphibian species need forest or really high quality habitat, and most urbanization, most agriculture is not really good high quality habitat for amphibians. So if you increase those types of habitats or decrease how much the others are connected, it can really have an impact alone on how many amphibians can survive. So that's one of the main reasons, probably the primary reason why we think amphibians are actually going extinct at this point in time. What we also see is that there's an alarming amount of diseases that are impacting amphibians right now. And I just want to talk about three of them to this point. The first one is called BD. You may have heard it as is called the chytrid fungus. And this is something that's really unique because in the 1980s or so, we started seeing a lot of amphibians in the Central America start dying off really, really fast and really, really large amounts of them. And it started in this kind of western area of Costa Rica. And Dr. Karen Lips is a scientist that studied this and started noticing it. And she and her colleagues identified that it was this type of fungus that was harming these amphibians. Basically, the fungus would get into their skin and clog up their pores. And for the little tiny baby ones that had little mouth parts, it would basically make those deformed. And what she saw over the course of about 20 or 30 years was that the fungus was moving to the east slowly. Every year it get more east, more east, more east. And along the way, it was killing thousands and thousands of amphibians and hundreds of species. So this fungus was really, really nasty, and it's still around today. And what we know is that there's a couple things unique about it. This BD fungus is really almost everywhere in the environment, and you can even find it around Chicago. But it's not always harmful or toxic to amphibians. There's a couple reasons why we think this might happen. We're still testing it out. We think that there might be something to do with the environment. So the temperatures are warming up from climate change. And we think that might have this relationship with making this fungus really toxic to amphibians. And there could be a couple strains of it too. We're still trying to really identify why it's so toxic and what's happening with it. So I have another question here. Is this fungus considered an invasive species? No, it's not actually. It's actually considered something that's native to most areas in the U.S. There are some areas that it's not necessarily called invasive, but where we don't detect it. But folks and scientists can actually bring it to that area if we're not careful. So nowadays, when you go and study, especially in aquatic areas where this fungus lives primarily, we have to disinfect all of our equipment so we don't transfer this fungus around. The second one I want to talk about is called ranavirus. It's actually a virus that occurs. And again, this is similar to that BD fungus. It's usually in the water, but not always. And it affects these amphibians by infecting them and killing them. And again, it's something that we detect in a lot of areas, but it's not always harmful. In fact, it could be so specific that you can have ranavirus kill a bunch of frogs in one wetland, and then if you go to a next one just a few hundred meters away, it can have no die-offs of frogs at all. So it's a really weird, weird virus that we're still, again, studying as much as we can, and it impacts other organisms as well, not just amphibians. The third one is a new one, and it's called B-Sal. It's another fungal infection that currently is mostly isolated in Europe. And what we know of today is that it mostly, if not entirely, impacts only salamanders. So this is something that's really alarming too, especially because if you think about those lungless salamanders that I'm so passionate about, the highest diversity of those salamanders for anywhere else in the world is found in the Southeast US, North Carolina, Georgia, Tennessee. There are more lungless salamander species there than anywhere else in the world. The second is in South America, in Central America, in parts of Mexico. There's a lot of lungless salamanders there too. So there are salamanders in Europe that are pretty diverse, and that's where B-Sal is currently currently isolated to. But we're worried, really worried, that it can come to North America and impact the species that are there. So someone asked if there's a picture of this fungus, and there are pictures. I didn't put one in this presentation, but this picture here is showing you a die-off of frogs from a fungus. So we also know that pollutants will harm amphibians. This can happen in a couple ways. So effectively what we see is that, especially in water bodies, in wetlands and ponds, that whole area of that water is being drained by the landscape. So that landscape can be, that watershed that drains into that pond or that wetland or lake can be really big sometimes, or it could be really small. And when you apply pesticides or nutrients on, let's say, farm crops, or if homeowners apply these things to the landscape, all that kind of goes somewhere when it rains. And a lot of times it goes into habitats that amphibians live in, wetlands or ponds. So what that can do right up front is that if it's high enough in concentration, it can actually kill amphibians outright. And that can cause death to a lot of amphibians right there. What we also see is that if these pollutants are in lower quantities, then they can cause deformities. So these are a couple pictures of leopard frogs. This one here is missing a leg. This one has an extra leg. And there could be some developmental issues. So what we see is that when these frogs lay their eggs, and as they develop in the water, if that water has pollutants in it, then certain types of those pollutants can cause these deformities, where frogs can actually live and hatch out, but they can have these extra limbs or different issues. So it's not just killing them outright, but it can make them deformed. And a lot of times what it can actually do is alter their sex. So what some pollutants can do, and most of the time this is what we see with amphibians, is that it can take male frogs and turn them into female frogs, or both male and female frogs. So those pollutants can actually change how the frog develops. And that's another question I got was, do we know which pollutants cause these? And really it seems to be a couple kinds of pollutants. Effectively, it's these insecticides a lot of times, or herbicides that have certain compounds that can trigger these deformities basically. And then what we see is another set of there are pharmaceuticals. So a lot of times, when we ingest pharmaceuticals for us, they have certain hormones in it, and those hormones can go through the wastewater system and enter the groundwater sometimes. And those pharmaceuticals can directly change the sex of these frogs and sometimes salamanders. We also see that some pollutants as well can, non-pharmaceuticals can actually alter the sex of frogs and salamanders too. So it's really a wide array of them can do this, can cause these deformities or cause these sex reversals in frogs. Okay, so I want to talk a bit about climate change. And this is something, as far as we know, that currently isn't having a really widespread, as far as we know, big impact on amphibians right now. But what a lot of my research did was talk about and ask questions about, what climate change is doing for amphibians in the future. So this is a cool study that looks at some climate change issues that we have with frogs. And what we see is that there's a couple things. The first one is that what we're seeing now is that climate change isn't necessarily really killing off. It's not harming amphibians in terms of their dying off right now, at least not in wide amounts. But it changes what's called their phenology. Basically, it just changes when they do things. So salamanders and frogs are sometimes breeding a little bit earlier in the year because it's warmer. Maybe they're breeding earlier in the fall or earlier in the winter or earlier in the spring. So it's changing kind of when they do things. And then this is a cool study that my former graduate student Brock Struker did, where he actually predicted where amphibians in the Midwest can live based on climate change. So Brock actually looked at where salamanders and frogs in these Midwestern states live right now. Then he took these maps and he was able to combine where the frogs and salamanders live with their climate that happens right now, and he can project where these species would live. And then as the climate changed throughout time, based on how much carbon dioxide we pollute or methane in the atmosphere, and how much or how little we change, Brock was able to predict in the future how many species of amphibians and where each species could actually live based on the climate. Remember, they have permeable skin and they need these kind of wet, moist environments. So as that changes with the climate, if those dry up or it gets too warm, then it can change where these frogs and salamanders could live across the world. That's what we're really most worried about, is that it could change where these things could live so much, or even that it might be just simply too warm that you might have these mass die-offs. So there's another question here. Is there something that we can do as hikers to prevent the spread of this fungus? Yeah, there is some things. So the main thing is effectively, if you go into any type of wetland or new environment and you're switching from, let's say, hiking spots, then you can disinfect your boots. That's probably the best thing. Since you're walking around, if you're walking around in the water or even in the forest, if you use a solution of bleach and water and dip your boots in those before you move to another location or another wetland or another forest, that really helps a lot. And if you have any equipment, if you have nets or anything with you, doing that as well. There's some other disinfectants too. The one I can think of that's not as harmful as bleach, or is a little easier to use, is called Vicron, and that can actually help disinfect your boots or other equipment that you have as well. But if you go to an area and you hike around and you don't use those boots or that equipment for 2 or 3 weeks, then that alone, just letting it sit aside and dry out for 2 weeks, will kill all the fungus as well. So if you're hiking a lot like me, or you're out in the environment a lot like me, then disinfecting your boots could really help a lot. Okay, so I think we have some more questions here. Okay. The last thing I want to talk about is pet trade and what we're calling overexploitation. So that really deals with a couple different things. What we have is that there's this huge interest in people keeping amphibians as pets, and that's a great hobby to have. But oftentimes what it can lead to is people taking animals from the wild. And they might take animals that are rare, or that are in a small home range, or that aren't found very often, and they're taking them from the wild habitats, and then they're trading them or selling them online, or to other friends and family. And what that does is, if enough people do it, we see that it does a couple things. It not only takes animals from the wild so they can't breed and keep populations going, but it can actually introduce diseases if you release them back. So that's a huge issue we have as well. And there's some areas, especially in like Southeast Asia, where frogs and salamanders are really a food source. So they're collected for food in large, large numbers. And that again removes these animals from the wild. It can transmit diseases. So what we see is that this is just another human impact that's happening, where physically taking animals out from the wild can harm their populations and also introduce diseases into these populations that can harm them as well. So it's another threat of one of many that amphibians are facing as well. Okay, so let me know if you have any questions. Go ahead and type them in or ask them in some other way. If there aren't any questions, we'll keep moving on. So what I want to talk about now is why this matters. So we think about amphibians, and I told you all the cool things about them, and a lot of you are probably excited about them and interested more, but still some people aren't, and they want to know, why should I care if these frogs die or these salamanders die? So for me, I think there's just an intrinsic value in these. If these animals exist on Earth, I think they should still exist on Earth, and humans shouldn't be causing these extinctions. But if you look at it from a different way, ecologically, we know that salamanders and frogs and these amphibians are a really integral part of ecosystems, and they provide a couple things. So we talked about that study that I did that showed that there's more salamanders than deer, than birds, than small mammals in the forest in Missouri. And what that does is a couple things. The first thing that it does is provide a lot of food for other organisms. Things eat these salamanders and frogs. A lot of them do. Almost everything does, because these things are really great prey. Think about it. There's tons and tons of frogs around. If you go to a really good wetland, there could be thousands of frogs that use that wetland or are around that wetland at any given time. And they're usually pretty fat. They're usually pretty slow for the most part, and they're full of protein and nutrients. So because there's so many of them, and there's such a good source of protein and food, we see basically everything eating these frogs and salamanders. So they're a really integral part for the food web from the kind of bottom up. So if we start losing these animals, it might not provide a lot of food for other organisms. Okay, we have another question here. Are there any invasive amphibians in the Chicago area? The answer to that is no. There are no invasive amphibians in Chicago, but we do have species here that are invasive elsewhere. And the main one is the bullfrog. If you go west of the Mississippi River in the United States, especially across the river, 50 or 100 miles, then technically bullfrogs shouldn't live there, but they do. So bullfrogs are invasive even to the United States. But if you go to a lot of parts in Asia, we have, again, imported bullfrogs into Asia for food and for pet trades. They've gotten released, and they have now are invasive in China. Okay, there's another question here. Why are there so many amphibians by mass in ecosystems? Is it because of their food source? That's a good question. What we know is that there's a couple reasons behind that. The first one is just how they breed. So usually amphibians have lots and lots of eggs. It's part of their life history, which is to have a ton of eggs. Very few species provide parental care, take care of them a lot. So they can have hundreds and hundreds of eggs sometimes. And that's just kind of to flood the market, to make as many as you can. The species that have less eggs usually have some sort of parental care. They'll take care of them a bit. So that's one thing, is that they generally have a lot of babies. The other thing is that they're usually pretty small, and they are ectothermic, right? So they don't need to create their own body heat. So that means that they can have a physiology that's really slow. And when you combine those, having a lot of animals, a lot of individuals, you have this really slow life cycle that doesn't need a lot of food or a lot of area because you're small. It means there can be a lot of them around. So instead of fighting and competing for a lot of resources across a large area, they can do that across a really small area. So that means that you can fit more salamanders and frogs in an area than you could, let's say, like a small mammal or a bird. So all those combined make them a really great candidate of being, having a lot of them around, just being really high in biomass. Okay, so what else does this mean? So part of my research looks at this from the perspective of, well, you have a lot of these frogs and these salamanders around. There's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds around. And yes, everything eats them, and that's great. But part of my research actually looks at how they go to the bathroom. So these animals are actually eating these bugs, and they're digesting the bugs, and they're going to the bathroom. And a lot of times, there's many, many, many individuals in an area. And even though they go to the bathroom a lot less, what that does is cycle nutrients. So here's a graphic of this. We have this cool salamander here, and it's eating these bugs, and those bugs have a certain amount of phosphorus in it. The salamander is going to eat that bug, and it's going to digest all that phosphorus that's in there. Whatever it needs, it'll keep. Whatever it doesn't, it's going to excrete out. It's going to go to the bathroom. So that salamander just took this bug and ate it, used it, and then went to the bathroom and excreted some excess phosphorus. So it converted this phosphorus from organic to inorganic. And now plants can use that phosphorus. So it seems insignificant when you think about one salamander doing it. But when there's thousands and thousands of salamanders doing it in one area, then that could be this really big, important link in this chain of cycling nutrients back in the environment. So we have another question here. Because amphibians are a food source, so someone has a storm sewer by the creek and salamanders hatch in there each year. Should you rescue them, or will they get back into the creek through the sewer? I would say that they're probably okay, because there's a couple reasons I say that. If you have the storm sewer, oftentimes it has water in there, so they should be okay with that. If they're laying eggs in there, then there's most likely enough water in there for them to survive. And then also, the second reason I say that is because most of the sewer systems around are pretty, what we call, leaky. So they have a lot of holes around in them. And I'm pretty confident that those salamanders will find a hole to kind of disperse and move away. If you wanted to save them, then I would do it cautiously, and I would think about if there is a wetland really, really close by. I mean, within 100 or so meters, a couple 100 feet around. Then that might be a good idea to kind of put them in a net in a bucket and release them into that wetland. But if there isn't one really close, then you could be introducing animals that shouldn't be in that area. So my personal opinion is just leave them in there. The mom usually knows, for the most part, where to lay. And a lot of times these salamanders and frogs will actually go back to where they were born to lay eggs as well. So it could be a case where there's generations of these things laying eggs in these sewers, but I don't think they need to be rescued. Okay, so we have amphibian poop. I convinced you that it's important, and I'm one of the few people in the world that studies it, which is a unique thing, I guess, for me. Why else are they important? What we've seen is that amphibians have led to a lot of medical advancements in the past several decades. They do this because they're really unique. And again, they've been around for hundreds of millions of years, and they're really, really diverse. So they have a bunch of stuff going on. In fact, what we know is that a lot of salamanders can actually regrow limbs, not just their tails. Entire arms and legs can be cut off and the salamanders will actually regrow them. Obviously, humans can't do that, but we want to. So trying to learn how these salamanders do it could actually teach us a lot about how we might be able to get humans to do it. Also, if you look at a lot of the skin of amphibians is really complex. Now, I said it was porous, and it is, but that's a really watered down way to say it. Amphibian skin is really complex. There's a lot of bacteria and fungi that is symbiotic, works with the skin. And a lot of times, frogs and salamanders can actually produce toxins that are unique to that species. So you probably heard of these poison dart frogs in the tropics. These amphibians, a lot of them will eat ants that are toxic, and they'll accumulate those toxins and change them a bit and exude them from their skin so they don't get eaten. And those toxins have been really important for a lot of medicines that we use today as humans. So if we start losing these species more and more, and they keep going extinct, especially ones that we don't even know exist yet, or haven't even tested to see what type of things they can bring, then we're losing a lot of chances to advance medicine. And that's another important reason we should save these things. Okay, so we have about 5 or so minutes left. I would be happy to take any remaining questions that you all have. Okay, we have another one here. Do we know how they regenerate limbs? And the question is sort of. And basically, they are able to regenerate their cells through this kind of mechanism of using, I don't want to say stem cells, but something like that. They're able to identify areas of their body that need regeneration and convert existing cells to create that new arm or leg. Okay, is trying to use amphibians for medicine detrimental to their numbers in the wild? And the answer to that is not in that specific case. So there's a couple reasons why. One of which is that usually when we do that, we're not taking a lot of animals from the wild to do it. We're taking, a subset of individuals, and then we're breeding them in the lab to do it. So that's one of the reasons that they're so good, is that a lot of amphibians can be bred in the laboratory. And most of that research deals with amphibians that are bred in the lab. So we're not continually taking animals from the wild. So it doesn't have a huge impact. What has an impact are other things that humans do much more. Okay. So amphibians lay a lot of eggs. How many of these eggs actually hatch? Or is it that they're dependent on where the eggs are laid? I think it's really dependent on where the eggs are laid, but most amphibians lay eggs where they're going to hatch just fine. So hatching rates of amphibians is really variable, but it's usually really, really high. So most amphibians that lay eggs have a clutch that most of the eggs will actually hatch out. It's after that point where things get hairy, because we don't have, every little tiny tadpole or salamander that hatches out of an egg doesn't exactly survive. So a lot of times it gets eaten or dies, or just doesn't make it to, metamorphosis, or sometimes dies when they're converting. So yes, a lot of them lay eggs, and a lot of those eggs survive and hatch out, but not a lot of those hatchlings actually survive after that. Okay, what kind of salamander is in this picture? This salamander here is called a black-bellied salamander, and this photo was taken by a friend of mine, Dirk Stevenson. And this black-bellied salamander is really cool because they live in the Appalachian Mountains, in North Carolina, Tennessee. They live all the way up to Pennsylvania, and these things live in streams. This is a big adult female, and she'll live in the side of a stream, and she'll lay her eggs in the water, and they hatch out, and then they go and live on the land, really on the edge of the stream. And this salamander here can be 8 inches long sometimes, really, really big, but their whole life, their entire life as an adult, and that could be up to 20 years, they'll live in the side of a stream. And if you have a desk at home, that's their whole area they live in their whole life, the size of a desk. So their home range is really, really small. Okay. Do I have a favorite kind of salamander? Yes, I do. The patch nose salamander, the one that I helped discover, is absolutely my favorite. My second favorite is probably this one here, the black-bellied salamander. All right. Are there a lot of examples of mimicry with frogs that are toxic? And yes, there are. There's a lot of examples of frogs and even salamanders that are toxic. Some that are colored, very colorful. And then there's another group of salamanders or frogs that mimic that coloration that are not toxic. So there's several examples of that. A lot of salamanders in the southeast United States do it. They'll have these red cheeks. Some of them will have red cheeks but won't be toxic. Some of them will be toxic. So there's a lot of that going on with salamanders and frogs as well. Okay, so another question here. I have a lot of tree frogs and toads in your property, and you just saw a salamander. That's good. Are there more salamanders than you're seeing? Yes, absolutely. Every salamander or frog you see in that area, there are dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands more that you are not seeing. Absolutely. The second one is, do salamanders make sounds? And yes, in fact, I actually published a paper on salamanders making noises. Most of them don't, but some of them can actually push air out of their throat and make a little chirping, kind of peeping sound. It's really rare. There's only been a couple instances of salamanders noted to do it, but it happens. Okay, another good question. What can you do to your yard to help support amphibians? There's a couple things you can do. The first thing that is really good to do is just to create habitat for them. And what that means is you can leave big piles of logs or brush just intact, and leaves on the ground. So when the leaves fall in the winter and the fall, if you just leave them there, or even if you just kind of grind them up and leave them on your lawn, that can actually help out amphibians a lot. But really, it's just trying to create habitat for them. So they really like brush piles. They like piles of logs. They like piles of rocks. And another thing you can do is actually create some habitats for them. You can build a pond for them, even a small pond. If you just dig a hole in the ground and put a cardboard box and then fill that up with water, amphibians can sometimes use that as well. The other thing is to try to support what they eat. So again, just having brush piles and leaf litter around will support insects that they eat. The final thing you can do is not put any pesticides or herbicides on your property or on your lawn or on your flowers beds or anything. If you have this kind of organic way of growing plants and taking care of your lawn, that will really help the amphibians around as well. Okay, looks like that's all the questions. Thank you all.
I have one more question.
Yeah.
Before we started, you and I had that conversation about research.
Uh-huh.
And that a lot of teachers watch these presentations.
Yeah.
And it might be valuable to just kind of talk about that it's okay for teachers to reach out for research.
Oh, yes. So every scientist that I know personally loves talking about their research. That's what we live for. We might not be great at it to the general public, but we like doing it. So I would say every scientist, especially ones that have a website, they would love for teachers to contact them to talk about their research. Most of us love talking to classes. We, can tell you how to do research yourself in your classroom. I mean, you name it. A lot of scientists are teachers as well. So we have that kind of that relationship too. So I would say don't be afraid of us. Some of us look pretty scary, but feel free to, I would say, to reach out to any scientists that you think it would be interesting. And if we don't have the expertise or time to do it, then we'll know someone that does.
Thank you so much. I think that's really important to move science education forward. It is to link everyone together. You know, public education and science education is really important. And I think taking some hits lately. And so having that partnership is really important. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I hope I want to encourage all teachers the same thing. Just reach out to scientists.
Reach out. Yeah, we love that stuff.
Yeah, it's really cool. Well, thank you again.
Thanks.
Again, really great information. I've already heard from a couple people. In fact, from our home state of Michigan, I just
cool.
that wants this information. So
Wow.
that's kind of cool, right?
Good deal.
I know. All right. Well, take care. I'm gonna close this out. Thanks again.
Okay.
We appreciate you.
Thanks.
Yeah. Bye.